Today, get ready to sink your teeth into a mind-boggling case, the intriguing story of the disappearance of Heather Bogle. I'm your host, Brandi. Let's get into it. On April 15th, 2015, a 28-year-old woman named Heather Bogle disappeared. Heather was a mother to her 5-year-old daughter, Mackenzie, living in Sandusky County, Ohio. Heather had been in a relationship with a woman named Carmela Badillo, but they had been having a rocky go at it recently and weren't on the best of terms, breaking up prior to that night. Apparently, the two of them had met at a work in the Whirlpool factory and started dating. Their problems began when Carmela began to think Heather had been sneaking around with other women. She even wrote a strongly worded letter expressing her feelings about their failed relationship and sent multiple texts indicating she couldn't rely on Heather, that Carmela was alone and that the only person she could truly trust was her mother. She followed up through text stating that she had never wanted to speak to Heather again in this lifetime. They had many arguments, but on the previous Wednesday, they had a particularly bad one. It looked like their relationship was over for good. But that's not all. Heather had been attending nursing school and had just finished her courses. That same week, she took her nursing exam to become a registered nurse. She failed. Not only that, but when her brother, Josh Fiesel, found out, he responded by lashing out at her. He texted her hateful messages, calling her too stupid to pass, and typical trash, a disappointment like her mother and father. Harsh, isn't it? Heather just wanted to provide for her daughter, giving her the best she could as a mother. All of this was happening at the same time, April 5th, 2015, the very same week she disappeared. Heather was last seen leaving the Whirlpool factory floor at around 6:17 a.m. on April 8th, that morning on a surveillance camera. This would be the last time she'd be seen alive. 2 years before her disappearance, she had attempted suicide due to her battle with depression. After that, she was admitted into a hospital and prescribed the antidepressant. Because of this, when she went missing, her mother and law enforcement feared she had made another attempt at her own life. A search was quickly underway. Within the next 24 hours, they would find Heather and her family's fears would be realized. April 10th, 2015, Heather's car was located outside the Somerton Apartments on Hickory Street. It was parked in a parking spot at the edge of the apartment lot. This led officers to believe that she had to have been somewhere inside or around the apartment complex. The interior of the car was empty, left in the same condition prior to her shift ending on the 5th. This is where the officers had found the handwritten note from Carmela to Heather. The night prior, Carmela had had a serious medical emergency requiring her to be taken to the hospital. Heather was unable to do anything due to her having a shift at the factory that night. That made Carmela feel less important to Heather than her job, and she spiraled, sending nasty worded messages through text. This is what officers had theorized to be the reason for the bad blood between the two. It also led to Carmela becoming one of the first suspects in her disappearance. The second, her abusive brother. You know, the one who called her demeaning names and chastised her for being too stupid to pass the nursing exam. His hatred for her was no secret to any of their family or friends. The only question was, could he have done anything to her? It wasn't until they opened the truck that they realized the truth about her disappearance. Inside, they found Heather's body. She had been murdered. Heather was found in an oversized red Mickey Mouse t-shirt, bruised to hell all over her, marks around her wrists and ankles like she had been bound or handcuffed. Her hair shredded off close to her scalp and her fingernails cut to the cuticles. There were defensive wounds all on her hands, which officers attributed to her blocking hits from her assailant. The cause of death had been surmised to be the 2 gunshot wounds in her back. Forensics stated that she had fought with all of her might until the moment she had died. Even though her nails were cut, investigators managed to find DNA evidence of the attacker under what was left. The perpetrator may have tried to hide their crime, but they didn't do well enough. Unfortunately, there were no matching samples on file in the police database. So the police did what was only natural, canvassed the area and questioned those in the apartment around the area for witnesses. The case had taken a hard left turn from missing persons to a homicide. At that time, her keys, wallet, work shirt, and phone had all been missing, and the officers had hoped to locate the items. One officer, Detective Sean O'Connell, dismissed the potential suspects Carmela and Josh quickly. The police had questioned Carmela, and it had become clear in the interview that she was not responsible for the murder. After a brief survey of the area and questioning a witness claiming to have seen a hooded figure drive the car into the parking lot and leave it the night of April 9th, sometime between 1:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. It had been reported by tenants in the Somerton apartments that Heather was no stranger to the complex. A resident had told officials that she had frequented apartment building 240 to purchase marijuana from one of the residents living there. Although this was never confirmed, Officer O'Connell began searching the building with purpose. During the investigation, the police turned their attention to Kiona Bohr, a single mother residing in Building 240 at the apartment where Heather's body was discovered. They got her name when they found a complaint lodged against her by another resident, noting the smell of marijuana coming from her room. Soon after, Detective O'Connell made the connection that on the day Heather went missing, Kiona made a comment on Facebook suggesting she could face 8 to 10 years for murder and pleading insanity. When questioned by police, Kiona was supposedly very nervous, and for Detective O'Connell, this was odd behavior for someone who denied any involvement. O'Connell wasn't convinced. But then the plot thickened as another person of interest emerged, Omar Satchel. Omar had a history of run-ins with the law, serving time for home invasion and possession of a firearm. Interestingly, Omar was reportedly present in Kiona's apartment the night Heather's body was found. Coincidence? Maybe, but the police were determined to connect the dots somehow. According to law enforcement, they received information from an unknown source suggesting that a third person may have been involved in the crime, Omar's friend, Kayri Jeffrey. They assumed he played a role in disposing of the murder weapon. The investigation took a wild turn as the police tried to piece together a connection between Kiona, Omar, and Kayri. The biggest piece of evidence was that Kiona was seen wearing a similar Mickey Mouse shirt around the complex, similar to the one Heather was found in. And lastly, Detective O'Connell also mentioned that Kiona had previously been in a relationship with a man Detective O'Connell had put away for 10 years on a first-time offense. For the detective, the evidence was irrefutable. But were they mere coincidences or crucial puzzle pieces in Heather's case? Only time would tell as the authorities worked to separate fact from fiction to bring justice to Heather Bogle. When the authorities were approached by Heather's mother or any of her loved ones on why they hadn't questioned any of the others on her shift that night, they were met with dismissive remarks and the assurance that O'Connell had the culprits in sight. The officers brought Kiona in for multiple interviews in an attempt to scare her into a confession of guilt in the murder of Heather Bogle, along with her accomplices, but Kiona repeatedly denied ever even knowing the victim. Kiona was even unaware of the report filed against her for the smell coming from her home. In the interviews they had with her, there was no evidence presented that tied Kiona or any of the people she knew being involved in the case of Heather Bogle. It seemed like O'Connell got tunnel vision and tried to force a confession. Unfortunately, the case hit a roadblock, and it later came to light that the detective in charge of the murder investigation, Sean O'Connell, had not been completely transparent in his handling of the case. His actions raised suspicions, and it was discovered that he had not shared all of his findings with the appropriate channels within the police department. Later, during the investigation, officials were able to interrogate Omar Satchel for the murder. Omar stated after the interview to reporters that Detective Sean O'Connell had said, "I know it's not you, but I'll make it you." The detective denied that he had ever threatened Omar, but the truth is still unknown. Omar's whereabouts for the nights in question, both during the murder and disappearance, put him in public bars and at Kiona's apartment while the murder took place. Either way, the detective was adamant that he could have easily traveled back and forth to commit the crimes. Lastly, Kayri Jeffrey was last seen with O'Connell's smoking gun. Kayri was reported to have thrown something like a black bag into the nearby river on April 10, 2015. Presumably, the bag contained the gun used to kill Heather Bogle. An entire dive team was dispatched to search the bottom of the river. They found nothing. There was no evidence any of the three had been the murderers, but the detectives still pressed forward. That's when a crucial piece of evidence was brought forward. Remember the DNA under her fingernails? It had finally been analyzed and cataloged. All three suspects in the investigation for the last year and a half were soon dismissed. None of them were matches. The situation became so serious that Detective O'Connell eventually resigned from his position. Soon after, an investigation into O'Connell's investigation tactics yielded better results than his case. Detective O'Connell faced a disciplinary hearing, as he was accused of sharing confidential documents related to the case and evidence tampering. These allegations were not taken lightly. Eventually, he pleaded guilty to one felony count, specifically tampering with evidence. It turned out that he had omitted the DNA results that excluded Kiona, Omar, and Kayri as suspects from the beginning. The severity of his actions was acknowledged, and he received a sentence of 2 years in prison. Kiona, Omar, and Kayri, the individuals who were under intense scrutiny, were found to have no involvement in Heather's murder. It's a reminder that sometimes even the most obvious seeming suspects can turn out to be innocent, and the truth can be obscured by the mistakes and misconduct of those in charge. But that doesn't solve the case of who killed Heather Bogle. In reality, it only brought the police back to square one. Heather's case stayed unresolved, haunting the community for 2 long years. It wasn't until Major Nick Katsopoulos, a fresh face determined to shake things up and breathe new life into Heather's case, entered. They carefully dissected the case, re-examining every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every lead that had been overlooked. It was a meticulous process, guided by their commitment to uncovering the truth. In a not-so-surprising turn of events, Major Katsopoulos swiftly ruled out the top 3 suspects that Detective O'Connell had previously focused on. Why? Because he followed the evidence trail, and it led him down a completely different path. There simply wasn't enough substance to connect them to the crime. This time, they decided not to fixate on any single suspect, but instead, they retraced Heather's final known steps, determined to unveil the missing puzzle pieces. Soon, the investigators were led to her digital footprint, checking into her email and social media activity, hoping to uncover any hidden clues that could shed light on her final moments. Now, here's where technology came to the rescue. Heather's GPS records were fortunately stored by Google, creating an electronic trail of coordinates that could unveil her exact whereabouts. It was like following a digital breadcrumb trail, getting them closer to the truth. It was the morning of April 9th, and at precisely 6:17 a.m., Heather took off from her shift at the Whirlpool factory. But what happened next? The coordinates from Heather's GPS records provided a clue. 13 minutes later, at 6:30 a.m., the data revealed that she was inside a trailer home just a few miles away from the factory at a place called Emerald State Trailer Park. Now, here's the kicker. Heather seemed to have spent around an hour inside the trailer home. The investigators' minds were buzzing with questions. So the police decided to pay a little visit to that trailer home, where Heather's GPS coordinates led them. And guess who they stumbled upon? One of Heather's co-workers, a guy named Daniel Myers. A new suspect? The plot thickens again. Daniel had never been questioned about Heather's murder before. Can you believe it? Well, maybe you could, seeing how incompetent the previous detective was. It seemed like a pretty big oversight, considering he was living in the same place where Heather had spent that mysterious hour, according to her GPS records, which no one apparently looked into. Investigators sat down with Daniel for an interview. He wasn't under arrest yet, but investigators were itching to get to the bottom of this. They wanted answers. Turns out, Daniel and Heather were on the same shift the night of April 8th, working side by side. And here's the interesting part. They both left work at the exact same time the following morning when their shift ended. Was this just another coincidence, or was there more to the story? When questioned by the police, Daniel claimed that he didn't really know Heather. He had only heard of her, in passing. So naturally, he couldn't wrap his head around why they were talking to him more than 2 years after the murder. The whole situation must have seemed like a huge twist for him. This was it, a startling revelation that led the investigators straight to Heather's coworker, Daniel Myers, a connection that had remained undiscovered for over 2 years. When they showed up to his trailer, Major Katsopoulos proceeded to be cordial. He approached Daniel nicely and asked him if he knew Heather or anything about her, sparking up a conversation to get him talking. After the brief interview, the police did their due diligence and politely asked Daniel for a DNA sample. But guess what? He declined. The investigators weren't about to let that slide. They swiftly obtained a warrant, allowing them to get their hands on Daniel's DNA, whether he liked it or not. They analyzed the DNA sample from Daniel, and you won't believe what they discovered. It was a perfect match to the DNA found under Heather's fingernails. Can you believe it? Police decided to do a little deep dive into Daniel's trailer, hoping to uncover some more concrete evidence. Their eyes were peeled for any trace of the murder weapon, but alas, no gun or bullets were found. However, what they did stumble upon was just as suspicious. Check this out. Less than a week after Heather's murder, Daniel went out and bought new floorboards, pieces for this very particular section of his trailer's flooring. Talk about suspicious timing, right? And that's not all. He also bought himself a brand new mattress and waited a few months to go to the dentist and fix a chipped tooth he had received sometime in early April. Now, why on earth would someone make such peculiar purchases right after a murder? The investigators couldn't help but put 2 and 2 together. Their theory, Heather met her tragic end right there in Daniel's trailer, shortly after leaving work that morning. It sent shivers down their spines to imagine the dark secrets that might have unfolded within those very walls. But wait, there's more. Police also stumbled upon multiple women's underwear hidden away in a safe right there in his trailer. And if that wasn't shocking enough, they also discovered videos of Daniel with various women beside them. And when we say with, I think you know what we mean. In the aftermath of Heather's murder, the pieces of the puzzle revealed a deeply unsettling truth about Daniel. The gravity of his actions extended far beyond a single crime. As the investigation progressed, an alarming pattern emerged. 10 women bravely came forward, sharing their painful stories of being sexually assaulted by Daniel. The accounts were chillingly similar. When faced with rejection, Daniel's behavior turned violent and aggressive. His victims recounted hair-raising experiences of being forcefully grabbed, thrown against walls, or violently slammed to the ground. It was a wave of horror that left a lasting impact on these courageous women. The legal proceedings unfolded, and Daniel found himself at a crossroads. The possibility of the death penalty loomed ominously, and he was faced with a life-altering decision: accept a plea deal or risk the death penalty. He took the deal. This choice meant that he would avoid the ultimate punishment, but would forever remain confined behind prison walls until the end of his days. The judge delivered the final sentence: a life term in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 20 years. It wasn't until Daniel was behind bars that he would truly confess the details of his crime to his cellmate. According to the fellow inmate, Daniel revealed a chilling motive behind Heather's murder. He claimed that it all stemmed from a moment of humiliation. You see, Heather had apparently laughed at him when he made advances towards her. But that's not all. Daniel stated that she confided in him about failing the nurse exam, her relationship failing with Carmela, and what her brother said to her, and he saw an opportunity to console her. However, his fragile ego couldn't handle rejection, and offense turned into something far more sinister. So let's get real here. Deep down, Daniel knew Heather better than she was aware. He frequently drove by her house, and they worked side by side on the factory line. Daniel would have observed her emotional state during that fateful shift, sensing her vulnerability. He cunningly saw a chance to take advantage of her, preying on her distress and personal turmoil. Heather was going through a lot, but she never saw Daniel in that light. Little did she know he had ulterior motives behind his facade. When Daniel invited Heather to his trailer that morning, he had a plan in motion. It was a calculated move driven by his twisted desires. But let me tell you, Heather fought back with every ounce of strength she had. She was a force to be reckoned with. In fact, Daniel later confessed to an inmate that she even managed to break his tooth during the struggle. Unfortunately, her valiant efforts weren't enough to save her life. But here's where things take a turn. In a desperate attempt to cover his tracks, Daniel resorted to cutting Heather's fingernails, hoping to eradicate any trace of DNA linking him to the crime. However, the forensic investigators managed to collect crucial evidence, the DNA that would later be matched to Daniel himself. It was Heather's last stand that became a beacon of hope for other potential victims, sparing them from the same fate. Now, here's the mind-boggling part. Daniel thought he could get away with murder. For a brief period, it seemed like he did. In fact, he had the audacity to make sure he was noticed. He attended Heather's funeral, signed the book of condolences, and even had the nerve to donate $125 to a GoFundMe campaign set up for Heather's daughter. It's almost as if he wanted to revel in his own twisted sense of power and control. His attitude after the murder and his ease in being noticed begged questions and sparked uneasy rumors and questions. Had he done this before? Now here's where the plot takes an even more bewildering turn. There is no concrete evidence or any foundation for this to stand on, but there was another woman in Daniel Meyer's life who had inexplicably committed suicide. Leanne Sluter, another employee of Whirlpool and his ex-girlfriend. She was also the mother of his son. Leanne, 38 years old at the time, was found lifeless in Clyde, Ohio. The circumstances surrounding her demise were perplexing, to say the least. According to Daniel, he discovered Leanne's lifeless body in her own bed on the 1st of March, 2009. The initial investigation determined that Leanne's death was a tragic suicide by gunshot wound. The case appeared closed until Heather's murder cast a spotlight on these interconnected tragedies. Authorities decided to reopen Leanne's case, hoping to uncover any overlooked details. Ultimately, they reached the same conclusion based on the existing evidence and photographs from the original investigation. During the reopened investigation, Daniel's relatives provided authorities with a shocking piece of evidence, a suicide note they had discovered among Daniel's belongings. This heart-wrenching letter was addressed to Daniel and revealed Leanne's inner torment. She described feeling like an empty shell, claiming that Daniel had worn her down, used her for financial gain, and callously discarded her when someone else caught his eye. The discovery of the note shed new light on Leanne's tragic fate. She was found with a single gunshot wound to her chest, with a .22 caliber rifle found nearby. These disturbing details raise countless questions and leave us pondering the true nature of Leanne's untimely demise. But karma has a way of catching up. The truth unraveled slowly but steadily, piece by piece, until Daniel's web of deceit came crashing down around him. Justice was served, and he was held accountable for his heinous actions. I'm Brandi, and this is Killer Bites. Thank you for watching.